Well, hello, this is Pastor Scot Conway. You're listening to the audio or you're watching on video. You can find us online most easily at qxchurch.org. qxchurch.org. The QX actually is an abbreviation for Quest Christian. You might be wondering how the X is Christian. Well, you can go to qx.org to look that one up, but that's questchristian.org. You can find us at, or qxchurch.org. We are the how-to, real answers, explain it all. Maybe it doesn't mean what they say. God-trusting, Bible-believing, saved by Jesus church. Today we're doing one of those maybe it doesn't mean what it says days, which we do from time to time. Now, it is right now August of 2012, and the hot political issue going on right now, and has been flaring up all over our country, is about gay marriage. Now, I've kind of stayed out of the issue for a while, but it's getting to be so inflamed that I thought, well, I'm going to go ahead and address this because there are a few key things here. Now, one of the things that we want to take a look at is what God has to say about homosexuality. Because the Bible is actually silent on gay marriage. I mean, if you're going to look up gay marriage in the Bible, where are you going to find it? It doesn't specifically talk about it one way or the other. It hasn't been an issue culturally, historically, in really any culture in the world at any meaningful level ever in history. This is a brand new thing. This is a 21st century thing. And because it's never really quite come up this way before, because it's this whole new different thing, we've got a different set of issues to deal with. Well, of course, behind all of it is something that has come up for thousands of years, and that is homosexuality itself. Gay marriage as an issue is new, but homosexuality is old. Now, the Bible does specifically tell us that homosexual practices, specifically men and men, is an abomination before the Lord. Now, everyone have their Bibles. Let's open it up to Leviticus 11:10. Leviticus chapter 11, verse 10. It says, "But all in the seas or in the rivers that do not have fins and scales, all that move in the water, any living thing which is in the water, they are an abomination to you." Oh wait, sorry, that wasn't the homosexuality one. That's the one where eating lobster is an abomination before the Lord. Okay, let's skip forward to verse 41. "And every creeping thing that creeps on the earth shall be an abomination, it shall not be eaten." Okay, so that's that one about eating snakes is an abomination before the Lord. Okay, well, let's pop over to Deuteronomy. There's got to be something in here somewhere, right? We know that homosexuality is an abomination before the Lord, don't we? Let's see, Deuteronomy 17, right at the beginning. Here we go. "You shall not sacrifice to the Lord your God a bull or sheep which has any blemish or defect, for that is an abomination to the Lord your God." Okay, well, that wasn't it either. But we do get the idea here. There's a lot of abominations before the Lord. If you eat shellfish, lobster, shrimp, crab, that is an abomination before the Lord according to Leviticus. In Deuteronomy, oh, and snakes, of course. Let's not forget the snakes. Deuteronomy 17:1. It's an abomination before the Lord if you make a sacrifice at the altar of the tabernacle, because at this particular time there was no temple yet. If you make a sacrifice and the animal you brought to sacrifice has a blemish on it. But however, if we do skip forward, we do get to some of this later on when we start talking about gender roles finally. Deuteronomy 22:5. Deuteronomy 22, verse 5. Deuteronomy 24, okay. In 22:5 we have, "A woman shall not wear anything that pertains to a man, nor shall a man put on a woman's garment, for all who do so are an abomination to the Lord your God." Okay, well, I guess that's cross-dressing. Some people actually interpret that as a woman's not allowed to wear pants. Let's see. Yeah, we might have a little bit of trouble in here today if that's still the case. Well, let's look at another one. Deuteronomy 22:5. Oh, no, we just did 22. 24:4. 24:4. "Then her former husband who divorced her must not take her back to be his wife after she has been defiled, for that is an abomination before the Lord." More and more abominations, huh? What that one is if you're married and you get divorced, You are not allowed to go back and remarry the husband you previously divorced if you had been married in between. Now, I could go on. I'll just tell you a little bit about this particular practice. This was sort of a sneaky practice when you could get a quick, easy divorce and then quick, easy get remarried. It was a way of doing prostitution. Is one man would marry all of the women, and then to keep it moral, what he would do is give her a certificate of divorce that afternoon. Then she would officially marry the other guy for the night, so that way it's a moral relationship because they're married. And then he'd give her a certificate of divorce in the morning, and the other man would remarry her the next morning. And that's kind of how that worked. And so that was a practice in the area at the time, and that verse speaks directly to that. But the Bible does say that homosexuality is an abomination before the Lord. If you go to Leviticus 18:22, and this one's legit, you can really go to Leviticus 18:22. If you go to 18:22, the King James reads, "Thou shalt not lie with mankind as with womankind. It is an abomination." So it's right up there. It is horrible before the Lord. It is as bad as eating shellfish or a snake, which we hear tastes just like chicken. And so if you're going to do things like that, you have to understand that you're committing an abomination before the Lord according to the Old Testament law. And homosexuality is one of the things that's in that category of abomination before the Lord. So what does this abomination thing actually mean? One of the meanings of the term abomination is that you are ritually impure. Now, why would this be such a big issue? The ritually impure has to do with you eating unclean foods, you're doing an unclean thing, you're doing something that bars you from going to the tabernacle, that bars you from going to the temple. Because there's certain rituals you have to follow, there's certain qualifications you have to have in order to be allowed to do certain religious things when you're living in a theocracy. Now that makes some sense, I hope. It's a theocracy. That God is the direct ruler of Israel. Now God has another level of problem. God is trying to create a people, create a cultural group that is going to have to survive for thousands of years. Do you make a different set of rules when your primary goal is we need to preserve these people as a people group for thousands of years? You have to make a whole different level of rules. And if you're running what's supposed to be a theocracy, later on it becomes kind of a split theocracy. But the kings are supposed to serve God, and then you still have the priests that have a lot of power and authority, and that continues for a while. You have to make a different set of rules in order to govern that. A lot of your rules have to do with the way in which you worship the Lord your God. We are a theocratic government, and that means that the worship of your God is central to the running of your government, and it is central to your operation as a culture, that you must be different from the people around you. There's a phrase used, holiness. Holiness just means set apart. Holiness means there's something different about you. Holiness means if someone looks at you, they see you're different. You're not like everyone else. When they look at Israel, they see they didn't do what all of the other pagan cultures did around them. And one of them had to do with temple practice. One of the things that was very, very common in the region of the day, and this is something that didn't go away for thousands of years, was in a lot of cultures, sexual practices in the temple was part of their worship. That they would go to the temple, there would be temple prostitutes, women and men, whose job it was to have sex with the people coming as part of their ritual worship. And that's part of what went on there. Now, I don't know all the details of it. I wasn't there. I haven't done a lot of study of it. I know it existed. Exactly how they went about that and what it meant to them, I'm a little uncertain of. And even the scholars, as far as I know, aren't 100% sure. But one of the things that they would do sometimes is you would basically be able to take power from. You would join with and gain that energy, gain that power, gain that strength. And you would do that by these representatives of the God of the temple that would then engage in this intimate contact with you, and that's how you would connect with that God. So you can imagine when God is coming into his people and saying, we're going to do things a little different here. We're not going to do the temple prostitute thing. You're not going to play this sort of game. That you're not going to go to the temple and have sex with men, have sex with women, and do all these other things. That's not going to be part of the deal with us. We are going to preserve a people group. You are going to have a lineage. You are going to operate yourself by a different set of rules. No close siblings, no temple prostitute worship, no sexual worship of any kind as part of your ritual practice. We're going to stick that in your marriages, and we're going to leave it in your marriages, and that's what that deal is going to be. That makes some sense, especially if you're trying to create a people group you're going to try to preserve for hundreds of generations. So this is still a huge issue. Because here's the big one. If you really want to see someone try to clobber someone with the homosexuality passage without any understanding that it could specifically be talking about the temple prostitute practice, where a male would go to one of these temples and as part of his worship would engage in sexual contact with another male who was there as a temple prostitute, and to become one with that person in order to worship that god. And the God is specifically condemning that. I think everyone would agree that that would be in the category that definitely condemned. Most conservative Christians will also take what it actually says and assume, and quite reasonably, to be perfectly honest, they're being completely reasonable in their interpretation of the scripture, that it applies to all sexual contact between men. And they also will often extend it to include all sexual contact between women, even though the Bible doesn't specifically address that until the New Testament. But here's the big one. Leviticus 20:13. If a man also lie with mankind, as he lieth with a woman, both of them have committed an abomination. They shall surely be put to death. Their blood shall be upon them. Now that's pretty serious. That's not only is it an abomination, it's an abomination with a death penalty. Well, let's take a look at some of these death penalties. Of religious practices. Now remember, this is a theocracy, so a different set of rules, and it's an ancient theocracy. 3,500 years ago, if you sacrifice in this theocratic government to a god other than the God who's the Lord of that government, that was the death penalty. Making a sacrifice to anyone other than Yahweh. Passing children through the fires. Now that was part of the worship of Molech. And God specifically said, this is another aspect of the temple worship we do not do. We do not do this. Now, this is the way the Molech worship would basically work. Molech would be built in bronze and hollowed out, and they'd put a fire in Molech. And so the hands would sort of glow red hot. For a blessing, and we put that in quotes, for a blessing from the god Molech, what you would do is when you had your very first baby, your firstborn child, you would bring the baby to Molech, and you would place it in the red-hot hands of Molech, so the baby would burn and die to get the blessing from Molech. And then, as if that's not bad enough, you would then take the corpse of your baby and you would build it into one of the walls of your home. So somewhere in your home is the corpse of your firstborn, as part of a way to get a blessing from Molech. And God very specifically says, okay, we don't do that here. That is not part of the worship of me. You might see it all around you in all the other cultures. We do not do that. That is not part of how you worship me. It was a death penalty if you did that. If you worship Baal, if you were a prophet and you did a false prophecy, you were to be put to death. You practiced necromancy, a whole bunch of other things that you could also do. If you committed blasphemy, if you blasphemed against the Lord, imagine if that was still a death penalty. A significant percentage of people who do subject, verb, swear word as part of their vocabulary would end up having to be put to death. Sabbath breaking. There was a case where someone was put to death for picking up sticks, gathering sticks for a fire on the Sabbath. That this was to be taken very, very seriously, especially early on. God is huge in the beginnings when he's setting things up. He cannot allow people to be breaking rules he just set. I mean, imagine the deal going on. They're like, weren't you there? Weren't you part of the group that just all swore obedience to this, and you're already ignoring it? People got in big trouble because they're trying to set a precedent right out of the gate. A lot of sexual practices were capital offenses. A rape. If you were a man and you raped a betrothed woman in the countryside, that was a death penalty. Loss of virginity by a woman prior to marriage to someone other than her husband or her betrothed, while still falsely representing herself as a virgin, that was a death penalty. Adultery was a death penalty for both the woman and the man. A death penalty. Now, in order for it to be adultery, she had to be married to another man. It had nothing to do with his marital status, it was her marital status. Now, let's pause for just a second on why that would be considered so serious. Is if a woman gets pregnant and the lineage is so critical to what tribe you belong to what inheritance you get, all of these things rest on what that lineage is. You have to know whose baby that is, right? And in an era with no birth control, the probability of getting pregnant is significantly higher. And you have to know whose baby that is. And so adultery was a very, very serious thing. And that's part of why later on King David is considered to be in so much trouble. And what do people talk about in that one? David and Bathsheba. They don't talk so much about David and Uriah. I talk about David and Uriah because he got Uriah killed, along with the whole front line of his men. And he committed adultery with Bathsheba, which was considered an enormously grievous sin. Because that is staining lineages, that's staining bloodlines. And if you look in Matthew and you look in Luke, you see the importance of bloodlines. That they trace Jesus' bloodline straight through all the kings, and then they, in Matthew, and then in Luke, they take Jesus' bloodline through Mary's father, all the way back to David through another son. And so the bloodline is important. You have to know when it says that so-and-so begat so-and-so, that it really was the first so-and-so that begat the second so-and-so. And it can't be the first so-and-so. We're pretty sure probably begat the second so-and-so, but we're really not 100% sure whether the wife was with some different so-and-so, so who knows. But somebody begat somebody, so we got people here. But these lineages, these bloodlines, the genealogies were critically important, and that was one of the ways to protect it. If you were in the family of a priest, and your dad was a priest, and you became a prostitute, that was a death sentence. Certain activities with a male involving like layings with women, homosexual activity, is also a death penalty. Bestiality was a death penalty. Murder, of course. Smiting a parent. If you were a kid and you hit your parent, that was a death penalty. If you cursed a parent, now imagine if that was still a death penalty. If you're yelling and screaming and you shout out, I hope you die, I hope something bad happens to you, that could be a death penalty. Kidnapping, negligent homicide, being found in contempt of court, lying in court on another capital crime was also a death penalty. So there's a lot of death penalties. This whole thing of the men with the men was only one of them, and I don't think anyone is arguing that all of these things should be death penalties. And some of the things are common. Some of the things we think we should be allowed to ignore. Some abominations before the Lord, like eating shellfish. I've been to a buffet, a seafood buffet, where I got to have lobster and crab and shrimp, and so abomination, abomination, abomination. And so it puts some of these things in perspective. But the Old Testament isn't the only place you find some of these things. You also find some of this in the New Testament. Romans 1:26-27, and you can look that up in the Bible too. For this cause God gave them up to vile affections, for even the women did change the natural use into that which is against nature, and likewise also the men, leaving the natural use of the woman, burned in their lust toward one another, men with men, working that which is unseemly, and receiving in themselves that recompense of their error, which was meat. Now this is the English translation. If you go into the Greek, it reads pretty close to the same, has some different implications. But one of the ideas here, this could be talking about, now, the surface meaning, if you just read the English translation, keeping in mind that the people who are translating from the Greek, they have the assumptions of what they think it means based upon the teachings that they've had. Homosexuality wasn't a big political issue in their day, and so as a consequence, there's really not much in the way of point and counterpoint for them to consider. It just wasn't anything people did. If they did, they kept it secret. Now that everything's kind of out in the open, now that it's becoming a big issue, Some of these things, quite frankly, they warrant another look to see if we can go past the interpretation of the translators and see what is actually in the Greek. Now, I'm not going to break out the Greek for the sake of time, but one of the possible interpretations here is that you're talking about a group of heterosexuals who, even though they're heterosexual, engaged in sexual contact with men during ritual orgies. I mean, remember, we're talking about the Roman Empire. You can look up orgies, bacchanals, stuff like that. There was a lot of stuff going on in the Roman era. And as Christianity was reaching out to the Gentiles, so the non-Jewish people, the people that did not grow up under Jewish law, they're getting the people that grew up in Roman culture, that grew up, worshiping these other gods. And that some of these things were common cultural practices. And Rome even got worse as the years went on, and the Christian church kind of reacted against that by getting more and more sexually conservative as the Roman Empire was getting more and more sexually liberal. One of the possibilities here is that it's the ritual orgies, kind of the meat sacrifice to idols thing. If you don't eat meat sacrificed to idols, if you know it's sacrificed to the idol, until you know the idol is nothing. And in these ritual orgies, in these bacchanals, the worship of Dionysus, Bacchus, the god of wine, basically the god of partying, or Pan, who's another god of partying, or Aphrodite, who's a goddess of a different kind of partying. Whatever their frame of reference is, and you read some of the Greek stories about all the stuff that Zeus did and who he did it with, and why we have all these demigods running around in mythology. There was some stuff going on. And here, one of the possibilities, if we're going to limit it as to what God's talking about, and kind of assume that in general as Christians we have freedom, we're saved by Christ, the dividing line between a Christian and a non-Christian is accepting Jesus Christ as your Savior, and God still says that don't do this. Don't go to the orgies. Don't engage in the ritual practice. Don't be worshiping Aphrodite, Pan, Dionysus. Don't be doing this. Don't be eating the meat sacrificed to idols. And until you know it's just a barbecue, don't do it. All this sexual activity, keep it contained. I mean, guys, you're allowed to be married. Ladies, you're allowed to be married. Have sex with your spouse. Don't be doing this whole other thing. Be faithful to one another. And it's this whole different game being talked about. Now then we have another list. 1 Corinthians 6, 9, and 10. Now this is one where we're talking about a group of people that won't get into heaven. Now there's a couple of possible interpretations of this list. Let me just touch on what is in the list. Know ye not that the unrighteous shall not inherit the kingdom of God? Be not deceived, neither fornicators, nor idolaters, nor adulterers, nor effeminate, nor abusers of themselves with mankind, nor thieves, nor covetous, nor drunkards, nor revilers, nor extortioners shall inherit the kingdom of God. Now that's quite a list. Now some people will note in here that, well, you have the abusers of themselves with mankind, that's the homosexuals, and you have the effeminates, and that's kind of like the gay guy that does the whole queer eye for a straight guy sort of thing, and that's what that's talking about. Okay, well, you could make that argument. Let's even suppose that argument is correct. Well, the list also includes fornicators, idolaters, adulterers, thieves, covetous. Now pause there for a second. How many of us are innocent of coveting? Innocent of looking at what someone else has and wishing you had it, or wishing they didn't have it because you can't have it, or being even willing to accept it without earning it, without deserving it. That's covetousness. Most of us have gone through that at some point or another. Nor drunkards, nor revilers, nor extortioners shall inherit the kingdom of God. That's quite a list, and some of the things on that list are really easy to do, and honestly, aren't all that attacked in the church. But man, do we go after some of this other one. Now, in the effeminates, the actual position there is a catamite. It's not just a soft man or a feminine man. There's a job of a young male prostitute, a young male sex slave, whose job it was to see to the sexual needs of his master. Now, in this particular case, I think it was very likely, since it's going on, all of the things people are doing willfully, is it someone who has pursued that job? Because it's a pretty cushy job if you don't mind engaging in that sort of activity. You get to basically live in the master's quarters. So as far as your lifestyle, it has a pretty nice lifestyle. And if you kind of gone for that particular position and that's your pursuit, that would probably qualify the person here. And as far as the homosexuals, maybe that is general homosexuality. Maybe it's back to that temple worship again. Or maybe it's the counterpart to the one who uses the catamite, who keeps the sex slave, saying, hey, if you have one of those and you became a Christian, cut it out. Get with your wife and only your wife. 1 Timothy 1, 9 and 10. Knowing this, the law is not made for a righteous man, but for the lawless and disobedient, for the ungodly, for sinners, for unholy and profane, for murderers of fathers and murderers of mothers, for manslayers, for whoremongers, for them that defile themselves with mankind, for men stealers, for liars, for perjured persons, and if there be any other thing that's contrary to sound doctrine. Well, that's quite a list, but then you get down to liars and perjured persons. Liars? How easy is that? That's in the same list. And so we might jump on some of it, but keeping in mind that there's a list here. And of course it could also still be talking about that temple worship, that temple practice as part of the things people were doing in the worship of other gods. And they might have continued doing it. Well, what's wrong with it? It feels good. You know, I'm not getting someone else pregnant. What's the big deal? Jude 1:7. But even the Sodom and Gomorrah cities, about them in like manner, giving themselves over to fornication, going after strange flesh, are set forth as an example, suffering the vengeance of eternal fire. That's probably about as clear as you get of it being actually about sex. But you know, Sodom and Gomorrah had some pretty serious issues. That they were willing to rape the guests. Now in Genesis chapter 19, this is where the angels show up. They're going to tell Lot that Sodom's going to be destroyed, you need to get out. And they assault Lot's house. Now, the core organizing principle of all of society in this day is something called the law of hospitality. That is the high law of the land. That's how civilization was organized in that day. And these men are violating the number one organizing principle of civilization of that day. That they want to violate these men that are already the lawful guests of Lot. He cannot allow that. The magnitude of importance of the law of hospitality is that by the law of hospitality, Lot is actually more willing to give up his daughters to the crowd than his guests. That's how important the law of hospitality is. And these men were willing not only to violate the law, but to violate at the level of homosexual rape of these guests. That's very serious. And doesn't that explain more of why Sodom and Gomorrah would be destroyed? That they were the epitome of a lawless society. And if they are willing to violate the ultimate organizing law of civilization, and their culture catches on, how bad is that going to get? And then back, of course, with more ritual practice and possibly a way of gaining some of the power. So when we look at some of these things, it gives you a perspective on where homosexuality as a relationship practice lands. If it is talking about the ritual practice in temples, that's different. If it's talking about a committed relationship between one man and another man, a committed relationship between one woman and another woman, that might be something different. We don't know. In this cultural group, in our culture, we don't do this. We cannot allow this. But you know what? It's not that far to get to the other borders. You cross the border, you go outside where we have jurisdiction, you can do what you want. Don't do it here. Does that make sense? So if a church wants to say, we don't do that here, if you want to do that here, you go somewhere else. I don't think a lot of people are going to have a problem with that. Now, if someone's going to be a good, solid, fundamentalist church, we don't do that here. If you want to do that, you go somewhere else. You talk about smoking and drinking and dancing. We don't do that here. If you want to do that, you have to go somewhere else. I think that's perfectly valid. On the other hand, to walk out your doors, to walk out of where you have jurisdiction and demand the whole world follow your rules is a different level of moral conviction. Now, the Christians that go out and fight for this, they're fighting for traditional values. They have a reason behind what they're doing. And it's a logical reason, it's a cultural reason, it's a reason based upon long-standing tradition. And that's what they're standing up for. They're not standing up for hate. They're not standing up for bigotry. They see it as a moral issue. Now, if you think homosexuals are born that way, if you think homosexuals have this genetic thing where they're incapable of loving in a sexual way a member of the opposite sex, they can only engage in sexual relations and romantic connection with members of the same sex, and you believe that is genetically programmed into them and there's nothing they can do about it, and that they have no ability to contain this in any way, shape, or form, or to abstain from it, and that's just who they are, you're probably going to see them like a racial group. You're going to see them in the same way that we look at blacks and Hispanics and whites and Asians, that you'll almost see them as a racial group. And you'll expect them to have the rights of a racial group. If, however, you see homosexual propensity, it may or may not be natural to them, it may or may not come from some trauma they suffered when they were younger, but you see homosexual behavior is a moral choice, that they are choosing to do something that according to your faith, the way you see all of this, is morally wrong. That you see it a lot like, adulterers wanting to have their adultery validated. That I'm a married man. If I'm looking around and I see a drop-dead gorgeous woman and whatever my standards of attractiveness are, am I likely to be attracted to her at some level? Of course. If my wife sees a drop-dead gorgeous guy that whatever her standards are of attractiveness, that she's going to look at him and feel an attraction to him, is that going to be something normal for her? Yeah. Where do we have a problem with this? When you walk it out at a level that we don't think you should be allowed to walk it out. And we have this thing sometimes called an affair of the heart. Some people draw the line there. And pretty much everyone has drawn the line by the time you get to actual sexual adultery. And so is that natural to have those kind of attractions? Yeah, that's natural. Does that make it okay? Having the attraction, okay, sure. Acting on it, no. And so if you see homosexuality as a moral issue, regardless of where your attractions lie, you're generally going to be opposed to it. Does that make sense? And so if you're religiously trained and you have a more traditional upbringing, how are you likely to see it? Like they're a racial group? Or you're more likely to see it like it's a moral behavior? You're likely to see it as a moral behavior, and you're opposed to legally recognizing what you see as an immoral choice. If, on the other hand, you see them as genetically designed that way, and that's just the way they are, and God made them that way, then you're going to kind of see, well, why are we denying them their rights? They should have these rights. It's like not letting blacks marry. And that's where the debate comes. But both sides are so judgmental about each other. I mean, they are more willing to knock heads than have a discussion. And that's just the political reality of the way things are done today. They draw their line in the sand. I'm on my side, you're on your side. I'm allowed to shoot arrows at you, and I'm allowed to try to block your arrows, but we're not allowed to talk. We're the enemy. And so we have to treat each other like enemies, instead of treating each other like brothers. We're Americans. We're family. We're people. Let's try to have a conversation here. Let me try to understand how you're seeing it. And please try to understand how I'm seeing it. And let's talk about this, and let's figure it out and see where we're going to go with this. What accommodation can reasonably be made for both sides? And the church is rightly afraid of certain things. One of the things that has happened in some places that has allowed gay marriage, that has given rights to homosexuals, is the church and Christians have now been told it is a hate crime to speak out against homosexual behavior. A pastor in some of these countries can be arrested for saying the Bible says homosexuality is wrong. And if a pastor says that from the pulpit in some of these places, he can be arrested for that. So do you think that the American church and Christians in general are afraid that that's somewhere down these steps? That we're going to recognize them, we're going to give them rights, we're going to treat them just like they're a heterosexual couple and let them marry and give them all that legal recognition, and somewhere along the line we're going to get told that you are not allowed to say anything bad about them. That's a very reasonable fear, because that is actually happening in some places where homosexuals are being given these rights. It's a very legitimate fear, based upon an actual track record actually occurring in some of these places. Now, if we maintain the right to speak out on what we see as immorality, I think probably there would be a little less fear about that. Especially if it rose up to the level of like a constitutional amendment. It would be very hard to argue with that. It would be a constitutional amendment. But in some places, it is considered a hate crime to say that, God says homosexuality is wrong. People have been fired from their job. In America, fired from their job when homosexuality was an issue, and they said, well, I believe God says to hate the sin but love the sinner. And she got fired for saying that. That one sentence in one conversation where homosexuality became the topic of conversation, and she was fired for saying that. Because in some places already, you're not allowed to have a moral opinion on homosexuality other than it is just as valid as any heterosexual relationship. Now also on that side, if you look at the rationale for allowing gay marriage, the logic behind it, because remember, right now in most places, as of August 2012 in this country, it is still illegal. In some places it is legal, in most places it's not. The rationale of it also would logically allow for a whole bunch of other things. Logically it would. Look at the reasons being put forth as why we should allow it, and see where else could those reasons allow other things that we presently don't allow. And when you begin to look at that, logically, you say, okay, what might be some unintended consequences of that logical argument? I got into this with my niece one time. She got so mad at me because I was telling her, based upon what you just said, then this would be allowed, and this would be allowed, and this would be allowed. Are you in favor of those things too? And she said, well, no, don't be ridiculous. I said, but why not? Well, because that's different. And I told her, now you realize if someone was in favor of those things you're just arguing against, you sound just like the people you say are stupid and bigoted. If I'm in favor of that, can't I equally say you're ignorant, you're bigoted, you don't know, you don't care? Why do you want to discriminate against these people? And, after she got done being angry, even her homosexual friend had to say that, okay, he's got a point. She wants the right to get married to her girlfriend, but even she had to admit that, okay, he's got a point. And that you have to approach the argument differently. You have to understand where it goes. And that's part of why that side is such an easy target. On the Christian side, well, we already covered the stuff in the Bible about what else it might mean. If you don't have an anti-homosexuality bias when you go in, it might be much more limited than we think. In fact, some of the words for homosexuality weren't in common use to be able to be translated that until I think the 1800s. And then extending it to female-to-female relationship, that's not actually in the Bible. It didn't talk about that. It's male-to-male. Why? I don't know. I couldn't tell you, other than that probably goes back to the temporal practice, the ritual practice of the sexual release as part of the worship of a god. Now, right now, countries around the world that recognize same-sex marriage. Some proponents of same-sex marriage say, well, dozens of countries all over the world. It's not a dozen. As of right now, I've been able to find 10. Canada is one of them, just our northern neighbor. Argentina is another. Then as we cross over the Atlantic, we have Iceland, Norway, Sweden, the Netherlands, Belgium, Portugal, and Spain, and then South Africa. As of right now, those are the countries that recognize same-sex marriage. And that also means those are countries we can go look at to see what is the cultural impact of it. And that's also where we go look to find out in some of these places, you're not allowed to say homosexuality is wrong. You're not allowed to quote scripture. You can't even read that verse out loud from the pulpit. If you read the verse out loud from the pulpit saying that homosexuality is an abomination before God, that can be considered a hate crime. Isn't that bizarre? And isn't that something that pastors and parishioners should rightly be concerned about? Traditional marriage is what they're trying to defend. One of the problems is, what is traditional marriage? If we look in the book of Genesis, is polygamy a traditional marriage? How many wives did Jacob have? 2. Were there any children that weren't from one of his wives? Yeah. 2 handmaidens, a handmaiden per wife. How about with Abraham? We go to our patriarch. Abraham and Sarah, they did the handmaiden thing there too. How many wives did David have? How many wives did Solomon have? Is that a traditional marriage? We go to the Middle Ages. In about 600 AD, the Pope had to make a declaration. Now consider the impact of this declaration. Why it would have to be made as a church edict. The Pope had to declare a marriage is invalid unless both people getting married consent to be married. Now think about that. In today's standards, that would seem like it's a ridiculous, obvious thing. But part of what that hints to us is the high probability that some men and women were being married off to each other against their own will. They didn't want to get married, but they got married anyway, against their own will, against their own consent. They just got informed. You're married now. We did the ceremony, you're husband and wife. You don't get a say. The Pope had to say. They have to consent. They have to agree to be husband and wife. You can't just marry off whoever you want. They have to agree to it. Well, since this is America, we are talking about traditional marriage in America. We go to 1776. Were arranged marriages still common in 1776? Yes, they were. Is that what we mean by traditional marriage? We need to protect the right of parents to arrange their marriage for their children. Now, even in arranged marriages, the kids still have to consent. But she's not allowed to choose. She can only say yes or no to who her parents choose. Same thing the other way around. Either she can say no, or he can say no, or the parents can say no. And without everybody agreeing, yes, the answer is yes, the parents both agree on both sides, their children, adult children both agree on both sides, then you can get married. But if any of them say no, then you weren't allowed. That's the way arranged marriages work. Arranged marriages weren't well, we picked a husband for you, you have no choice, you have to get married. They could try to cajole and coerce and buy her off with a big dowry or something, but they couldn't make her do it against her will. Well, let's move forward. We're located in the state of California. And about 1850, California becomes a state. So 1850, California becomes a state in 1850, and people were getting married in 1850. Did you know that? All the way back in 1850, people were still getting married. Yet men could find a woman and marry her so long as she was old enough. She had to be old enough to get married. Because darn it, if she wasn't at least 11 years old, she wasn't old enough to be a wife yet. 11! She could be as young as 11. I remember a scene from a Little House on the Prairie where they're talking to Mary, the older sister. And she had turned 16 and was still single, and said, well, you need to find yourself a man before they're going to start looking at you as an old maid. 16, not married, old maid category. 14 would have been a little bit more common in some of these cases. Or maybe we're looking for a more modern traditional marriage. We'll go to the 1950s. In the 1950s, it was still illegal. If you were white, you weren't allowed to marry a black or Hispanic. It was illegal. It was against the law. So one traditional American marriage is no interracial marriages. Just not allowed. Is it part of our traditional marriage that the husband's allowed to beat the wife? That was a right for thousands of years. And in fact, that's one of the urban legends, and I really think it's probably an urban legend. The stories of the rule of thumb is that you're only allowed to beat your wife with a stick no bigger than your thumb. And while where the rule of thumb came from might be an urban legend, the fact that husbands were allowed to beat their wives, so long as the person who beat her up was her husband, that was okay. If someone else hit her, well, then that's not okay. Someone's going to go deck the guy. But as long as it's the husband, it's the man of the house. Even though it had fallen out of practice, up until 1979, we still had some places in the country where you had what was called the head and master law. The head and master law said that the husbands had final say over a lot of different aspects of family life. The wife could not enter into a contract by herself without her husband consenting to it. And the last law of that was repealed in 79. The actual practice of that had gone away before then, but it was still on the books. Because that used to be the practice. The wife could not make those decisions. Legally, she was barred. And it was 1993. Now, this is a little different than gets publicized sometimes. In 1993, the final state changed the definition of rape. It used to be the definition of rape had to do with sexual intercourse by the use of force or the threat of force by a man who is not her husband. If they were married, it was legally impossible for him to be found guilty of rape if he was married to her. And that didn't go away until 1993 was when the final law of that was repealed. And even today, just as a matter of legal precedent, even though technically a husband can rape his wife, they will almost never, ever, ever charge a husband with rape. This is what they will do, is they will charge a separated but still legally married husband with rape. That's why the laws actually got changed. Is some men found out that, oh wait, so until that divorce is final, we're actually legally married. So if I rape her, I'm not guilty of rape, I'm only guilty of assault, and that's, what, 6 months, maybe, probation? It's just an assault, it's not a rape, because we're not legally divorced yet. And that's how come those laws got changed. So when you begin to look at what is traditional marriage, you begin to see that this whole thing of traditional marriage being one man, one woman for life isn't necessarily how we've always done it. In fact, back in the slave days, in the earlier 1800s, even blacks weren't allowed to marry other blacks. They weren't allowed. It was illegal in a lot of states in that country, mostly southern, of course, that they weren't legally allowed to get married. The marriages were not recognized by the law. I'm sure they still did it anyway, but the law didn't recognize it. So what traditions exactly are we trying to protect? The ancient biblical tradition of one man and as many women as he can support, which is still the practice in a lot of cultures. And we still don't recognize that legally. Even though a man can legally be married to 5 or 10 wives in some parts of the Middle East, if he comes here, we do not recognize wives 2 and on as his wife. Which can be very odd, because what we're basically telling this perhaps very moral, upstanding man in his country is, you're not married to her. You're living in sin. And if something happens to you, she doesn't have the rights of a wife. She can't make the decisions of a wife because we do not recognize her as your wife. Your senior wife, still back in the home country, that's your legal wife. She's the one that has to do this. Now imagine what that's saying to the woman who's here as his wife, too. The same sort of thing. A lot of it is, kind of a don't ask, don't tell sort of thing. And so long as she's presented as the wife, and we won't necessarily ask for the paperwork, we'll kind of take their word for it. But if we know, she doesn't count. Even though they're properly married where they're from. And we don't recognize those marriages. And we're being asked to recognize these kind of marriages that historically have never been recognized before. Even though we don't recognize still marriages that have been recognized in some places for thousands of years, including in our own Bible. And the traditions we're trying to protect, in some way, shape, or form, are relatively new traditions. It's kind of the way we've done things since probably about the 60s. A more egalitarian marriage, where the man might be the leader in the home, he might be the head of the household, but he's not like the boss just because he's the guy and she has no say. It's a voluntary structure if they do that, because legally they both have equal say. And so they can voluntarily choose to structure it in the hierarchy if they want to, but the law doesn't recognize a hierarchy. The law doesn't impose a hierarchy. This is a whole new thing. We talk about in the Bible sometimes that it was Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve. You hear that, right? Anyone ever heard that one before? Well, that's true too, but the husbands who often with the many wives, it was Adam and Eve. It wasn't Adam and Eve and. And especially when you get to David and Solomon, there's a whole bunch of ands there. So what do we do with this issue? I will tell you, as someone who has studied sociology, that I see the social cultural march in the direction of gay marriage looks pretty inevitable to me. In some way, shape, or form, we're going to have to learn to live with it. And I think because it's such a hot topic, that it is a worthy issue to go back into Scripture, not the English, because this was translated by people who already had that presumption, but go back to the Greek, go back to the Hebrew. Let's take another look at this. Let's try to study it and see if maybe we, as a Bible-believing church, have room to maybe be more accepting. That we don't have to say, well, yeah, it's a sin before God, but, we all sin and we'll just accept it. I mean, basically we're saying that we are going to validate sin. I don't know that that's going to be a very good answer. I mean, we are all sinners. But we're kind of supposed to be trying to aim in the direction of not doing it on purpose, not doing it willfully. And so we have to be careful about how much of that we're going to validate. I mean, there's enough of it already. None of us are perfect. All of us sin. But how much credence do we want to give to the way people sin? Well, we're the how-to real answers explain, maybe it doesn't mean what they say, and we just touched on that. Maybe it doesn't mean what they say. Maybe we need to go back to the Greek. Maybe we need to go back to the Hebrew. Maybe we need to go do more of a cultural study. Maybe we need to look at what was going on around them that there might have been this compare and contrast thing to, that might explain some of these verses and give us maybe a different level of insight where maybe we can make more allowances for things that were never really big issues. For thousands of years, there really weren't any big issues. Now it is. So maybe now's the time to go take a look and see what we see. Be faithful to Scripture, because we are God-trusting. We are Bible-believing. We believe this book. We believe this book. But we want to take a look at it and see, what does it really say? How do we really use it? What was the context in which these things were said? What's the social, cultural context around where these things were said? What might it be talking about? Trust the Bible. Trust God. Be saved by Jesus Christ. The dividing line between a Christian and a non-Christian, between salvation and not salvation, between heaven and not heaven, is Jesus Christ. And ultimately, that's the most important thing. And if we're at least willing to go take a look, even if a lot of us draw exactly the same conclusions, if we show we're at least open-minded enough, we'll go look. We'll take another look at it. You make some points. Let us go take a look and see where we land. And maybe we acknowledge you have a point and we still disagree with you. Maybe we see you have a point that we hadn't considered before. We explore it, and you know what? We think there's room for that. It might not be the way we're going to operate at this church, but maybe there is room for that. And that we don't need to go out of our walls and attack it, because maybe there is a place where that might be okay. And so that could be a way to resolve the issue. I don't know where it's all going to go. I mean, we are not a politically active church. We do talk about a lot of hard stuff, but we don't engage in much in the way of political debate. As much of anything, when we engage in political debate, we're trying to moderate the political debate. We're trying to create understanding between the sides. We want to define some terms so that we're all talking about the same thing and using language the same way. And then see if we can get the sides to try to understand one another. At the very least, we want to be understanding of both sides, and not just bitter and judgmental and knocking heads. Because even right here in this room, as small as we are, that we probably have people who have differing opinions on the issue, and have different reasons for their opinion, even when they agree on the issue. And for us, that's okay. We want an understanding, reasoned discussion on whatever issues we're dealing with. And we make allowances for people to have different opinions. I have a point. You may also have a point. We may disagree on our point. Now, if you don't have a point, well, then you don't have a point. You might have a position. But how do you back it up? What else could that mean? And at least if you have the discussion, you can clean up your side a bit. And say, yeah, you're right. I guess I am overreaching. Yeah, I guess if it's the whole abomination before God thing, I kind of need to be rallying against shellfish too. And I don't do that. So to be self-consistent, I need to be equally offended by all abominations before God, if that really is my honest, real reason. Or I need to be, equally vehement about all things that were death penalties in the Old Testament, if that's really my reason. Or maybe I just need to admit sometimes my honest reason is that it's kind of just icky to me. I don't like it. It makes me uneasy. It makes me question too many things I don't want to have to deal with. And I just pick my verses in here to back up the position I want to have be my position. But likewise for the gay marriage crowd. Some of them will cite Jesus as, well, you need to be loving and accepting, and you need to love people even though you think that they're a sinner, and he who is without sin cast the first stone, and stuff like that. Say, okay, well, that has some merit as far as that goes, but that doesn't mean you can ignore all of Scripture. I mean, you could make that same argument for child molesters, for murderers and rapists. Well, we wouldn't do that. So we have to be careful, again, how we play the game and think through the unintended consequences that are logical consequences. Maybe that you're not meaning. Because if that really honestly is your reason, where else does that go? That would mean throw open the prison doors. Who are we to judge? I'm not perfect. We shouldn't lock anybody up. Obviously, we're not going to do that either. Both sides need to be logically self-consistent. Both sides need to be more understanding, and both sides need to think through their side more. And then we can have a discussion, a cultural conversation in the marketplace of ideas, and sort it out and figure out, well, what are we as a nation going to do? Even if the religious people still disagree, okay, at what level do we still impose our religious convictions on the culture as a whole? At what level is that still appropriate? Is it okay here? Maybe it is. Maybe it isn't. But if we never have the discussion, we just have a war, I don't think we're going to come to a place where we're Americans first and sides second, where we're people first and even countries second, if we can't even talk about these things. Because we haven't even thought through our own side, so we couldn't even have a conversation if we wanted to. Well, there's your scripture on it. There's some culture on it. There's a little bit of history in there. Lots of things to think about and consider. This is Pastor Scot Conway at Quest Christian, qxchurch.org.